Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, December 20th, 2023. President Joe Biden asked about the Colorado Supreme Court ruling that Donald Trump is ineligible to hold office because of his role in the attack on the U.S. Capitol January 6, 2021, said there's no question Donald Trump supported an insurrection. But he believes the court should make the decision whether that means Donald Trump violated the 14th Amendment and cannot be on the Colorado ballot. The Senate is recessing for the Christmas and New Year's holidays without reaching a deal on U.S. border security and therefore no deal to pass aid for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, since Republicans say all those issues must go together. But the Senate leaders are urging negotiators to keep meeting with the hope that an agreement will emerge that can be voted on in January. Justice Department sues a large land developer in Texas, saying it engaged in predatory mortgage lending practices against Spanish-speaking immigrants. United Nations Security Council members are still working on a resolution calling for a pause in the Israeli-Hamas war to speed aid to Palestinians in Gaza, with language that the United States would not veto. The scheduled vote has been delayed numerous times this week. And the U.S. and Venezuela swap prisoners, Venezuela getting a close ally of President Maduro, and the U.S. getting 10 Americans, and the extradition of former Navy defense contractor, the one known as Fat Leonard, who's accused of corruption. And we start with a reaction to the Colorado Supreme Court declaring that former President Donald Trump is constitutionally ineligible to be on the state's presidential primary ballot because he engaged in insurrection or rebellion. Associated Press writes the decision from a court whose justices were all appointed by Democratic governors marks the first time in history that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment has been used to disqualify a presidential candidate. Colorado's highest court overturned a ruling from a district court judge who found that Donald Trump incited insurrection for his role in the January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol, but said he could not be barred from the ballot because it was unclear that the provision was intended to cover the presidency. The court has stayed its decision until January 4th to allow for further appeals. Donald Trump's legal team says it will appeal the decision to the U.S. Supreme Court, and Colorado's election primary date is March 5th. A reporter asked President Joe Biden about this during his trip to Milwaukee today.
Is Trump an insurrectionist, sir?
Well, I think certainly it's self-evident. You saw it all. Now, whether the 14th Amendment applies, I'll let the court make that decision. But he certainly supported an insurrection. And no question about it. None. Zero. And he seems to be doubling down on about everything. Anyway, I've got to go do this.
President Biden speaking to reporters at the airport in Milwaukee. Reaction from some members of Congress. Bill Pascrell, Democrat from New Jersey, posting on X. The text of the 14th Amendment is crystal clear. Anyone who participates in insurrection is permanently barred from public office. Donald Trump incited a violent riot to overthrow American democracy. Of course, he should be banned from the presidency forever. And this from Congressman Corey Mills, Republican of Florida. First, there were unprecedented indictments in New York and Georgia, resulting in Trump facing 91 felony counts. Now, Colorado's leftist Supreme Court has removed him from the 2024 ballot. President Trump is a clear victim of political persecution. The bottom line is all Americans have the right to decide and vote for the president of their choice. That was from Congressman Corey Mills. Senator Bill Hagerty, Republican of Tennessee, was interviewed this morning on the Fox Business Channel.
You know, after going through all of H.R. 1 and S1 in the last Congress and the histrionics of the Democrat Party about enfranchising voters, we have a ruling here that would disenfranchise half of Colorado. Alan Dershowitz did a great job in the previous hour of shooting holes in this legal argument. There's been no due process here at all. This is a blatant political decision. I think the American public is going to see right through it. I was with President Trump on Monday. Every week that passes, the public sees more and more the desperation of the Biden administration. The fact that they're losing in the polls leads to results like this, and they have literally no interest in the democratic process. You hear threat after threat about Donald Trump and the democratic process being under threat. The real threat is rulings just like this.
Republican Senator Bill Hagerty on Fox Business Channel. C-SPAN spoke with Hugh Lowell, political investigations reporter for The Guardian newspaper, about how the Colorado Supreme Court handled two questions in this case. Does Section 3 of the 14th Amendment apply to the President of the United States? And how was it determined that Donald Trump did engage in insurrection or rebellion?
What this Colorado Supreme Court found was the lower court erred in its determination that the presidency was not included in the office or kind of an office that insurrectionists could not hold. They affirmed the lower court decision that Trump engaged in insurrection, and they reversed on the decision of whether, the presidency was included in Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. I think it's going to be a tricky thing for Trump's lawyers to argue that the presidency is not included, because Section 3 isn't necessarily meant to be exhaustive as a list. If you're a strict textualist and you look at the plain language of Section 3, it doesn't talk about every single office. It talks about having previously taken an oath, and Trump does take an oath. When you become president, you do take an oath. And so I think that's not so much the designation that they want to challenge. In conversations with people close to Trump's legal team in the last 24 hours, I think the thing they will challenge more is with respect to the insurrection element, because, Section 3 talks about, did the defendant engage in insurrection? And engagement is a broad term, but it does have case law behind it. And generally it refers to whether someone had an active role. And how does the Colorado Supreme Court get to active role? Well, they say Trump incited insurrection in part. And the fact that Trump hasn't been charged or convicted, I think puts a dampener on that. And I feel like that's where the Supreme Court, if they want to rule for Trump, would find an opening to do that.
Yeah, it's been mentioned. He wasn't impeached for this in the Senate, and he hasn't been convicted of insurrection. So how do they rule that he is disqualified when those things haven't happened?
Yeah, I think that there are two separate issues here. With the impeachment, that is an argument that Trump has made separately. He's making a double jeopardy claim on his immunity appeal to dismiss the indictment in federal district court. He is saying, I wasn't, convicted, but I was tried by the Senate, and so that precludes criminal charges against me. That's an argument that did not fly in federal district court. It's unlikely to fly based on the case law in federal appeals court. And I think in general, that argument is seen to be the weakest of all of the arguments Trump has. I think there is a stronger point with respect to the fact that he hasn't been charged, because there is a school of thought that that these things are coterminous. That if there is no evidence or that has been presented in trial court and in a trial court that you have engaged in insurrection or even incited insurrection, and incitement is a charge that Jack Smith, the special counsel, didn't bring. It's a higher test than what the Colorado district court used when it came to its determination that Trump engaged in insurrection. They used the test of clear and convincing. In federal court, it's normally reasonable doubt. And so it will be interesting to see what the interplay is between these kind of three things that are all kind of moving together at the same time, and how the Supreme Court applies these tests.
Hugh Lowell, political investigations reporter for The Guardian newspaper, part of C-SPAN's interview on Wednesday morning's Washington Journal program. A little more from the Associated Press article on the Colorado Supreme Court ruling. Donald Trump lost Colorado by 13 percentage points in 2020 and doesn't need the state to win next year's presidential election. But the danger for the former president is that more courts and election officials will follow Colorado's lead and exclude Trump from must-win states. And this from ABC News, presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy pledged on Tuesday to remove himself from Colorado's Republican primary ballot in response to the state Supreme Court's ruling that former President Donald Trump is ineligible to run in the state over his activities surrounding January 6th. Ramaswamy promised to stay off the ballot until Trump's eligibility is restored. He called upon his and Trump's 2024 Republican primary opponents to take the same steps. Colorado's Republican Party responded to the candidate in a post on X, noting that he would not need to withdraw from the contest because they'd be shifting from the state-run primary to a party-run caucus if the ruling was to stand. That was from ABC News. This is Washington Today. The U.S. Senate is going out of session for the Christmas and New Year's holidays, joining the House. The Senate had stayed in session this week as negotiations continued on U.S. immigration and border security, with Republicans requiring that issue to be part of the president's $100 billion request to help Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. Tuesday night, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Minority Leader Mitch McConnell issued a joint statement that read, "Challenging issues remain, but we are committed to addressing needs at the southern border and to helping allies and partners confront serious threats to Israel, Ukraine, and the Indo-Pacific. The Senate will not let these national security challenges go unanswered. As negotiators work through the remaining issues, it is our hope that their efforts will allow the Senate to take swift action on the national security supplemental early in the next year." The two spoke today on the Senate floor about what happens next. First is Senator Schumer.
Negotiations will continue around the clock, reaching an agreement on a critical national security supplemental. As I speak right now, the negotiators are in a room down the hall trying to make more progress. I came by a few minutes ago to thank all of them for their hard work and encourage them to continue. The future, not only of Ukraine, but of our country and the Western world depends on it. Challenging issues remain, but we in this caucus are committed to addressing needs at the southern border and to helping our partners and allies confront and deter serious threats in Israel, Ukraine, and the Indo-Pacific. The Senate will not let these national security challenges go unanswered. Now, when we return in the new year, we hope to take swift action on the National Security Supplemental. Passing a National Security Supplemental is not going to be easy. It's one of the hardest things this Senate has undertaken in a very long time. It will take compromise, good faith, and recognition from both sides that nobody is going to get everything they want. Democrats will continue to work in good faith with our Republican counterparts to get things done. We will not abandon our principles on border, but we will work to find common ground wherever we can. And let me be clear, it will take cooperation from serious-minded Republicans to get this done. Again, it will take cooperation from serious-minded Republicans to pass a national security supplemental. I know there are some on the other side who will never vote for it, but there are many who understand the need to both give Ukraine, Israel, humanitarian aid for the civilians in Gaza and the Indo-Pacific, the help it needs, and to help fix our border, doing it in ways that are consistent with our principles.
Senator Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, the majority leader on the Senate floor. The minority leader, Mitch McConnell, Republican of Kentucky, followed.
Negotiations on border security continue to make headway. I'm grateful to Senator Langford for his uninterrupted focus on the task at hand, which is meaningful policy changes. Our colleagues at the negotiating table are under no illusions about how difficult it is to fix our nation's broken asylum and parole system. They're working on what would be the first serious repair in more than 30 years. But there's no longer any disagreement that the situation at the southern border is unsustainable and requires the Senate to act. This is the core of America's national security. It'll be an essential part of supplemental legislation to address pressing security challenges, and negotiations will continue in earnest until we get there. The Senate cannot afford to get this wrong. From South Texas to Southeast Asia, and from the Black Sea to the Red Sea, it's an historically challenging and consequential time to protect America's interests, our allies, and our own people.
The Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell today on the Senate floor. The White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre got a question from a reporter while they were flying on Air Force One about the U.S. border security negotiations and the president's national security supplemental spending request.
Now that there's not going to be a Ukraine border deal by the end of the year. What specifically is the president planning to do over the holidays to try to secure a deal for when they come back?
So, as you stated, there's not going to be a vote on the border security deal this week. We feel like it's going in the right direction. The conversations are going in the right direction. That's very important. Obviously, it's critical for Congress to move forward with our national security supplemental. And so negotiations, conversations are certainly going to continue. And so we hope that it moves quickly. It needs to move quickly. You've heard from us how critical it is if you're looking at Ukraine in the battlefield. The battlefield, it's hurting what's going on in the battlefield, that they're not getting this funding. They're getting smaller amount of aid. There's there's more aid for this month that we'll be able to give them. It is not, and they're continuing to get attacked, right, every day by Russia's aggression. So obviously we need to get this done. We need to get this done very, very quickly. And so we're asking, congressional Republicans to not hold this up, right? We've been very, very clear about that.
On that time, what specifically is the president going to be doing over the holidays? Will he be making phone calls to Republican leaders?
Well, I've said this many times to all of you, in front of all of you, whether at the podium or here on Air Force One, that the president has had regular conversations with congressional leaders. He has. He's been in touch with them. As you know, he has long-standing relationships with many of them, and he has given, obviously, his team, right, to have those conversations, to do the negotiations. They have his support, and the president has a history. We have done many of these bipartisan agreements over the past 2 years, and so we need a bipartisan agreement. That's the direction that we think it needs to go. The conversations are headed in the right direction, and that's what's important. We need to get this done.
The White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre holding a news conference on Air Force One. Reuters reports from Eagle Pass, Texas, that railroad companies and business groups are pressing the U.S. government to reopen trade routes on the Texas-Mexico border after authorities closed 2 crossings in response to a rise in migrant crossings in recent days. U.S. Border Patrol apprehended about 10,800 migrants at the southwest border on Monday, according to an internal agency report reviewed by Reuters. A tally several current and former officials said was near or at a single-day record high. About 40% were families or unaccompanied children. Returning to the U.S. Senate before they left for the holiday recess, they did pass by voice vote the remaining 11 military nominees, all 4 stars, that had been held up by Senator Tommy Tuberville, Republican of Alabama. He originally blocked all military nominations and promotions, hundreds of them, to protest the Pentagon's policy to reimburse travel costs for service members seeking abortions. He let them all but the top general nominees go through, and Tuesday, political reporter Ursula Perano asked him if he would object to these last few.
You still planning to object?
No, it just depends on how they do it. Sooner or later we're going to let them go through. I've given them 99% of them, and you'd think they would say, okay, what do we got to do to get these last 11? I've heard from nobody.
So you're not firmly committed to doing the UC objection that you've done on the other ones, on these last ones?
No. We're to the end of the year, and we'll see what it would look at their attitude, and it's just failed communication. I've never been anything like this where nobody knows what's going on.
Senator Tommy Tuberville speaking to a political reporter on Tuesday, and that night the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer asked unanimous consent to approve the final 11 military nominees, and there was no objection.
Mr. President, yesterday, 10 months of delay and finally an end on a positive note, the Senate confirmed the last of the military nominees held up by Senator Tuberville. Military leaders and their families who have had their lives put on hold for months can finally breathe a sigh of relief because the wait is over. It was a very good outcome, one that should not have been necessary. But now that the holds have been lifted and these nominees confirmed, I hope this never happens again. Let the experience of the past 10 months be a warning. No senator should use our military officers and their families as political pawns to push a political agenda, no matter how strongly they believe in that agenda. This was a long and painful ordeal for our armed forces, but it ended on a positive note for them and for our country, because Senator Tuberville didn't get one bit of what he asked for, only a lot of pain to military families. Let's make sure this never happens again, no matter how strongly any one of the 100 senators feels on any one issue. Don't hold the military families hostage.
That's Senator Chuck Schumer today on the Senate floor. One more bill passing before the Senate went into recess for the holidays. It was an extension of the Federal Aviation Administration through March 8th, 2024. Without it, funding would have expired at the end of this month in just a couple of days. Senator Schumer made the request Tuesday night.
And now I will move to pass the extension of the reauthorizing of the FAA. It's critical we extend this funding, as so many Americans travel for the holidays. It's going to give us more time for a long-term funding measure in the new year, so passing FAA funding tonight is good news.
That was Senator Chuck Schumer Tuesday night. The FAA authorization extension had been on hold by Senator Michael Bennet, Democrat from Colorado, not because he opposed the FAA, but to keep the Senate in session a few days longer, he said, in hopes that an agreement on U.S. border security could clear the way for passage of more aid to Ukraine to fight its war with Russia. On FAA, roll call writes that the bill would be the second extension of FAA's funding authority in the last 3 months as senators continue to negotiate a long-term FAA reauthorization bill that's been held up since June, and that Senator Maria Cantwell, Democrat from Washington State, the chair of the committee, said they are close to an agreement on changes to pilot training requirements, but the committee is still working through other contentious issues, like an effort to add more flight slots to Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport and raise the pilot retirement age. Reporting from Roll Call. On Wall Street today, the Dow down 475, NASDAQ down 225, S&P down 70. President Biden went to Milwaukee, Wisconsin today, touring a black-owned plumbing company that is replacing lead pipes. Money coming from the bipartisan infrastructure spending law that he signed. The president then spoke at the Wisconsin Black Chamber of Commerce about the economy and minority communities.
So far, we've created 14 million new jobs, more jobs in 3 years than any president's created in 4 years in history. This is a fundamental break from trickle-down economics that supercharged was supercharged by my predecessor, the guy who thinks we're polluting the blood of Americans these days. He cut taxes for the wealthy and big corporations, shipped good-paying jobs overseas, shrank public investment in infrastructure and education. We used to have the #1 infrastructure in the world. Now we're number 16 or 17. We're changing that. We hollowed out communities, leaving too many Americans behind. It's a cycle folks on 30th Street Carter here in Milwaukee know well. It's an area where it says it became the backbone of Milwaukee's industrial might. 10,000 black people migrated, tens of thousands migrated from the south to the middle of the country, to Milwaukee, for good-paying manufacturing jobs. Then decades of discrimination and trickle-down economics left communities like this one behind. But today, we're making sure Milwaukee is coming back and all of Milwaukee coming back. Mark my words. In Milwaukee, business applications are up 70% compared before the pandemic. The share of black people employed in Milwaukee in 2022 was the highest in more than a decade. But the investments aren't just about jobs. The investments we're making offer opportunity, hope to communities to fully participate in the economy.
President Biden at the Wisconsin Black Chamber of Commerce in Milwaukee today. A news article from WKOW-TV in Madison reads that Wisconsin was among the most competitive states in Biden's 2020 election win over former President Donald Trump and will likely be key to his re-election hopes in 2024. Trump is the leading contender for the Republican presidential nomination, and the party is hosting its national convention in Milwaukee next year. From the Houston Chronicle, Colony Ridge, the controversial Houston area developer that has been the target of viral anti-immigrant conspiracy theories, has been accused of targeting tens of thousands of Latinos with falsehoods and predatory loans, according to a federal lawsuit filed Monday. The lawsuit was announced at the Justice Department in Washington today by the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Kristen Clark.
Today, the Department of Justice and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau filed a lawsuit against Texas-based developer and lender Colony Ridge Development, LLC, and its affiliates for operating an illegal land sales scheme and targeting tens of thousands of Hispanic borrowers with false statements and predatory loans. Our complaint alleges that Colony Ridge's actions violate both the Fair Housing Act and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, two federal civil rights laws that prohibit discrimination in housing and lending. Let me note, this is the first predatory mortgage lending case brought by the Justice Department. The complaint also alleges violations of consumer protection laws, which Director Chopra will provide more information about shortly. The Colony Ridge development, also known as Terrenos Houston or Terrenos Santa Fe, is northeast of Houston and currently home to more than 40,000 people. The development has a massive geographic footprint, currently spanning across more than 33,000 acres, nearly the same size as Washington, D.C., and it is growing. Our investigation revealed that Colony Ridge operates as a one-stop shop for discriminatory lending. First, it targets Hispanic applicants with false advertising, promising home ownership on properties it claims have basic utilities such as water and electricity. Second, it steers applicants into seller-financed loans, exploiting their limited English proficiency in the process so that it can close the deal. And unlike responsible lenders who conduct a careful determination about whether an applicant can repay a loan, Colony Ridge does not verify income or any ability to pay, knowing that it stands to benefit if the borrower defaults on the loan. After locking families into loans that they can't afford, Colony Ridge then provides them with flood-prone properties. Many borrowers are then forced to sink additional money into making the lots habitable while Colony Ridge stands by, waiting for those homeowners to default on the loans. When borrowers lose their properties to foreclosure, Colony Ridge completes the scam's life cycle by purchasing the properties back for pennies on the dollar and then reselling them at even higher prices to new, unsuspecting borrowers. The impact of this unlawful, discriminatory, and fraudulent scheme is devastating. Nearly 1 out of every 3 Colony Ridge loans fails within 3 years. That is more than 10 times the national rate. And based on Colony Ridge's sheer size and how long it's been in operation, that equates to thousands of Hispanic borrowers who lost their homes because of this scam.
Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights Kristen Clark at a news conference in Washington. The lawsuit alleges that Colony Ridge sold more than 2,000 properties 4 or more times in 3 years. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau Director Rohit Chopra was also at today's news conference. He said that Colony Ridge lured in customers with ads on platforms like TikTok in Spanish, but all the documents and disclosures were written in English, and that's been illegal for decades. Washington Today continues in a moment.
People often think C-SPAN is funded by the federal government. In fact, we're a nonprofit organization that receives no government funding. As news consumption changes, you can help ensure the future of C-SPAN's unfiltered coverage of national government and politics. We hope you'll consider making a tax-deductible contribution that will support our daily editorial operations. To learn more, visit cspan.org/donate.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you find your podcasts. Our mobile app is free. Story from the New York Times, the United Nations Security Council pushed off to Thursday a highly anticipated vote on a resolution calling for a halt in fighting in the war in Gaza. and major increase in aid deliveries. The delay was at the request of the United States to allow more time for negotiations, according to diplomats. The delay followed intense closed-door consultations that failed to bring the United States and other members of the Council closer to a consensus. Some diplomats on the Council said they were growing frustrated with the United States' repeated requests for delays, and that it appeared unlikely that Washington would ultimately allow the resolution to pass. A major sticking point has been the question of whether the United Nations should take over from Israel the inspection of shipments of food, water, fuel, and other aid going into Gaza, diplomats say. That update from the New York Times. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken held a year-end news conference today at the State Department in Washington. Associated Press reporter Matt Lee asked him what it would take to get the U.S. not to veto a UN Security Council resolution.
At the UN Security Council, maybe right now, if there hasn't been another delay, or soon, there will be a vote on this Israel-Gaza resolution. What will it take, or what does the United States need to see in such a resolution for it not to veto it? And if that can't be done, and you end up vetoing it, aren't you not concerned that the number 3 priority that you mentioned in your opening, the coalition building, will be damaged, very badly damaged? The U.S. is already isolated internationally on this issue, and another veto aren't you not concerned that another veto will further isolate you?
You're right. This is going on as we gather here. We continue to engage extensively and constructively with a number of countries to try to resolve some of the outstanding issues in the Security Council resolution. The purpose of the resolution, as stated by the countries that put it forward, is to facilitate and help expand humanitarian assistance that's getting into Gaza, and we fully support that. In fact, the United States, from day one, has, I would argue, done more than any other country to make sure that that could happen. My first trip to Israel and to the region after October 7th, we focused on getting an agreement to start getting humanitarian assistance into Gaza. And a few days later, that started with the opening of Rafah. That was necessary, but very much insufficient. We've been working ever since to expand that. Just in the last couple of days, you've seen, again, as a result of work that many of us have done over the last several weeks, Kerem Shalom opening, so that not only are goods inspected at Kerem Shalom, which increases the capacity of the ability to get goods into Gaza, but now goods are going directly from and through Kerem Shalom into Gaza. In addition, we have commercial products going in, not just humanitarian assistance. We've made sure that we have a sustained delivery of fuel at levels that the humanitarian community tells us are necessary to make sure that desalination plants, sewage systems, telecoms, trucks, hospitals can be powered and function. And of course, we continue to work on this every day. For example, making sure that once assistance gets into Gaza, it can actually move around and be distributed safely and securely with predictable routes, times, access. So we've been at the forefront of all of these efforts. And we want to make sure that the resolution in what it calls for and requires actually advances that effort and doesn't do anything that could actually hurt the delivery of humanitarian assistance, make it more complicated. That's what we're focused on. We're engaged, as I said, in very good faith with other countries. We've been working this intensely. I've been on the phones about this for the last couple of days. Linda Thomas Greenfield, of course, in New York, has been leading our efforts. So I hope we can get to a good place. To the last part of your question, let me say this. Look, what I have seen from day one is that countries throughout the region, as well as countries around the world, want to work with us and are looking for American leadership in this crisis, even countries that may disagree with us on certain issues that have come to the fore. That's been a common refrain. I've been not only in the region multiple times and traveled to not just Israel, but to virtually all of our Arab partners and others, including Turkey. We've been on the phones constantly, including this week with all of our Arab partners. And the common refrain is they are looking for American leadership, and we're working to provide that.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken at a news conference at the State Department in Washington. At the United Nations in New York City, a spokesperson for the UN Secretary General, Stefan Dujarric, at a news conference, gave an update on the negotiations over a resolution.
Today, the Security Council is again supposed to vote on a resolution ramping up aid. It looks like it could be vetoed. What's at stake here? What's your message to the countries?
The 15 are meeting in conclave. They're continuing their discussions. We'll see what comes out of their discussions. Not for us to interfere with those discussions, which I understand are fairly intense. The Secretary General's own position is unchanged. He's been calling for a humanitarian ceasefire, and also he's been calling for the creation of the conditions on the ground to be conducive for broader delivery of humanitarian aid. Deji.
Today, according to local authority, after 75 days into the conflict, Gaza's death toll reached 20,000. Does the Secretary General have anything to say about this sheer number of casualties?
The number has been unacceptable and huge and sheer, and whatever adjective you want to use, for quite some time. Again, we want to see a humanitarian ceasefire. We want to see the guns fall silent so we can reach the people of Gaza who need the most help right now. And also, as Mr. Venezuela has said, as the SG has said, about reestablishing a political path to a two-state solution.
Spokesperson for the United Nations Secretary General Stefan Dujarric at a news conference at the UN in New York City. Reuters reports that the leader of Hamas paid his first visit to Egypt for more than a month on Wednesday, a rare personal intervention in diplomacy amid what a source described as intensive talks on a new ceasefire to let aid reach Gaza and free more hostages. From Fox News, the U.S. has reached an agreement with Venezuela to exchange a close ally of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro for 10 American prisoners who were being detained in the country. A senior Biden administration official confirmed the exchange on Wednesday, hours before the Americans were turned over. The released Americans include several who were considered wrongfully detained, as well as 4 who were not. Among the latter is Malaysian businessman Leonard Francis, known as Fat Leonard, who assisted in one of the largest corruption scandals in U.S. Navy history. That was Fox News. President Biden spoke about the prisoner swap as he was leaving Milwaukee.
You probably already know, today 10 Americans have been released from Venezuela prison. They're in an aircraft. Can you hear me? They're in an aircraft on their way home to the United States. And we've secured the release of every American being held in Venezuela on their way home. And we have no higher priority than the release of detained and/or hostage Americans being held hostage. In addition to that, Venezuela thus far is keeping their commitment toward the democratic election. Not over yet. They've made detailed commitments. We'll see if they hold them, but we're going to hold them accountable. And matter of fact, one hostage being sent home is one who is going to be tried. And what else I want to say to you? Total, Venezuela has released 20 political prisoners in Venezuela on top of the 5. They're all Venezuelans that have been let out of jail. And they have a right to a democratic future. That's all I wanted to confirm with you.
President Biden with reporters at the airport in Milwaukee. Earlier in the day, when the prisoner exchange with Venezuela was the subject of unconfirmed reports, John Kirby, a spokesperson for the White House National Security Council, answered reporters' questions about the larger significance as they were flying with the president on Air Force One.
I know you're not confirming Venezuela right now, but in general, is there any concern that with deals like this, like prisoner swaps, that it sets a precedent that countries can get whatever they want and they take American hostages?
We deal with this question nearly every time we arrange to get Americans home. I'll just say this. nothing's more important to President Biden than the safety and security of Americans overseas. Commensurate with that obligation is doing everything we can to get those that are detained overseas in a wrongful way home with their families where they belong. Sometimes that means you got to make some difficult decisions. He'll never make a decision that's going to be damaging to our national security interests, but he will not be afraid of making decisions that could be difficult, maybe a little hard to swallow at first, in order to get Americans back home with their families. That's really the goal. That's really the purpose. And again, I'm not going to confirm these reports right now, but I can tell you that he doesn't take any of these decisions lightly. They're all very serious and soberly applied. But again, the focus is getting wrongfully detained Americans home, and we've been very successful in this administration. Now, more than 30 have been released and back with their families, and we're going to keep up that effort.
John Kirby, Strategic Communications Coordinator for the White House National Security Council, with reporters as they flew on Air Force One, and later White House officials telling a number of news organizations the prisoner swap had been agreed to. It was confirmed by President Biden himself, the U.S. releasing an ally of Venezuelan President Maduro in exchange for 10 Americans in jail in Venezuela, and the extradition of a former defense contractor known as Fat Leonard, who was allegedly part of a large U.S. Navy corruption case. About the ally to President Maduro, this from the New York Times. Alex Saab, who has been accused by the United States of profiting from starvation of Venezuelans, is a Colombian businessman and financial fixer for Mr. Maduro. He was indicted in 2019 in connection with a bribery scheme that siphoned off an estimated $350 million from a Venezuelan government housing project. Mr. Saab is one of several Maduro-linked officials and businessmen indicted by the U.S. government in recent years, including Mr. Maduro himself. That was from the New York Times. Today is the 4th anniversary of the U.S. Space Force. The Space Force website has this: the establishment of the Space Force resulted from widespread recognition that space was a national security imperative. When combined with the growing threat posed by near-peer competitors in space, it became clear there was a need for military service focused solely on pursuing superiority in the space domain. Congressman Michael Turner, Republican from Ohio, Intelligence Committee Chair, posted this video.
Happy birthday to the United States Space Force. 4 years ago, we organized Space Force to recognize that space is a new domain. We have over 8,600 service members that are now serving in Space Force, including some members right at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. We thank them for their service and congratulations to the Space Force. May God bless you.
Congressman Michael Turner in that video. Vice President Kamala Harris recognized the anniversary of the Space Force at the start of today's National Space Council meeting in Washington.
And today, on the 4th anniversary of the establishment of the United States Space Force, I will recognize the Guardians who are with us. I'd like you to stand, please, so we can applaud you. There we are. Thank you each and all of you collectively for the work that you do. You make our nation so proud. And thank you for your service.
Vice President Kamala Harris, the Space Force is 4 years old. By comparison, the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps had their 4th birthdays in 1779. The Coast Guard did in 1794, and the Air Force in 1951. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter Word for Word. It's free, and get the stories making headlines in Washington emailed to you every day. Subscribe at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.